The red and blue lights violently reflected off the sterile white walls of the garage, turning the familiar space into a disorienting cage of color and shadow. The sudden, harsh demand to step out of the vehicle with hands raised sliced through the quiet night like a blade. For Elliot Vance, what had started as a late-night drive home after another grueling week in Washington had become a nightmare born of prejudice. Two arrogant patrol officers had believed they were catching a car thief in an affluent neighborhood. Instead, they had just handcuffed one of the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Justice. Their careers were about to end. The dashboard clock of the sleek midnight blue Audi A8 read 11:37 p.m. Elliot Vance released a long, heavy exhale, the kind that carried the weight of a 70-hour work week. As Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, his days were a relentless marathon of high-stakes litigation, congressional briefings, and the constant navigation of Washington's razor-wire politics. Tonight, all he wanted was a hot shower and the quiet sanctuary of his home on Willow Creek Lane in McLean, Virginia. The neighborhood was suburban perfection. Manicured lawns, ancient oaks standing guard, and stately homes set far back from the street. Elliot had fought for every inch of this piece. Raised in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, he knew the cost of every hard-won victory. At 45, with a Yale law degree and a record that commanded respect in federal courtrooms nationwide, he had earned his place in the American dream. He turned onto Willow Creek Lane, tires humming softly against the pristine asphalt. The street lay silent under the amber glow of ornate street lamps. Elliot pressed the visor button, and the massive custom-built wooden garage door began its slow ascent. He eased the Audi inside, the familiar scent of motor oil and cedar washing over him. He shifted into park and reached for his leather briefcase on the passenger seat. Before he could kill the ignition, the rearview mirror exploded with blinding light. Elliot froze. Red and blue strobes painted jagged shadows across the walls. The police cruiser's spotlight seared his vision, washing the world in harsh white. For a heartbeat, confusion reigned. Had he been speeding? No, he hadn't cracked 30 since exiting the Beltway. A broken taillight? The car had been serviced the week before. Then came the sound, the sharp, authoritative chirp of the siren, followed by a booming voice through the PA system. "Driver, turn off the vehicle and place your hands out the window. Do it now." Elliot's heart gave a strange, uncomfortable flutter, not from guilt, but from a deep, instinctual apprehension. He knew the statistics. He knew the files that crossed his desk every day at the DOJ. He was a black man in an expensive luxury vehicle in a predominantly white, wealthy neighborhood in the middle of the night. He drew a slow, deep breath, forcing his heart rate down. "Stay calm," he told himself. "This is a misunderstanding. You're in your own garage." He killed the engine. The silence that followed was instantly filled with the heavy crunch of tactical boots marching up the concrete driveway. "Hands where I can see them!" the voice barked again, much closer now. Elliot slowly rolled down the driver's side window and placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel. He squinted through the blinding glare of flashlights. Two officers approached, one on each side. The driver's side officer, a heavy-set man with a thick neck and a stern, weathered face, kept his hand resting uncomfortably close to his holstered weapon. His name tag read, Greer. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Elliot asked, his voice steady, modulated, stripped of emotion. The exact tone he used when cross-examining hostile witnesses in federal court. Officer Stanley Greer leaned in, flashlight beam never wavering from Elliot's eyes. "Whose car is this?" he demanded, ignoring the question entirely. "It's my car," Elliot replied. "I just got home from work." Greer let out a short, cynical scoff. He glanced over the roof to his partner, a younger, more nervous-looking officer named Ethan Ward. "Right. Just got home from work. Step out of the vehicle." Elliot's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "Officer, I'm sitting in my own garage. I haven't committed a traffic violation. Could you please tell me why you followed me onto my private property?" I said, "Step out of the vehicle now." Greer's voice lost its sarcastic edge, replaced by sudden aggressive bark. He slapped the flat of his palm against the roof of the Audi, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "Don't make me ask you again." Elliot knew the law backwards and forwards. Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer needs reasonable, articulable suspicion to conduct a traffic stop, and entering private property like a garage required a warrant, exigent circumstances, or hot pursuit. None of these applied. But he also knew that arguing constitutional law with an agitated armed patrol officer in the middle of the night was a dangerous game. "I'm stepping out," Elliot said slowly, telegraphing his movements. He unbuckled his seatbelt with one hand, kept the other visible, and pushed the heavy door open. As he stood, the crisp autumn air hit his face, a sharp contrast to the heated leather of his car. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative tie, hardly the attire of a car thief. Yet Officer Greer looked at him as if he were holding a crowbar. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car," Greer ordered, stepping into his personal space. "Officer Greer," Elliot said, reading the name tag and locking eyes with him. "My name is Elliot Vance. I own this home. I have my driver's license and the vehicle registration in my briefcase on the passenger seat. If you allow me to show it to you—" "I told you to turn around!" Greer shouted, suddenly closing the distance and grabbing Elliot by the bicep. His grip was entirely too hard, fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. Elliot gasped at the sudden physical contact. "Do not put your hands on me," he said, his voice dropping an octave, laced with a sudden absolute authority that usually made seasoned defense attorneys flinch. The tone caught Greer off guard for a fraction of a second, but it only seemed to inflame his ego. "Resisting? Are you resisting?" "I am standing perfectly still," Elliot said coldly. "But you are currently committing battery." Officer Ward, who had been hovering near the passenger side, hurried around the back of the car. Hey, let's just calm down," he said, though he looked more panicked than anyone. "Sir, just do what he says." "Ward, watch his hands," Greer snapped. He forcibly spun Elliot around, shoving him forward so he stumbled slightly against the side of his own car. The humiliation washed over Elliot like a bucket of ice water. He was a senior official of the United States government. He held clearance levels these men couldn't even fathom. He had spent his afternoon in a closed-door briefing with Deputy Attorney General Leonard Shaw, and now he was being manhandled like a common criminal in the sanctuary of his own home. "Spread your feet," Greer ordered. Elliot did not move. "I will not," he said, his voice trembling not from fear, but from a volcanic rising anger. "You have no probable cause. You have no warrant. You have illegally trespassed onto my property. I am telling you for your own sake to step back and let me show you my identification." "Oh, you're a lawyer now," Greer sneered. It was the classic arrogant sneer of a man who believed his badge was an absolute shield against accountability. "Listen to me very carefully. We've had a string of burglaries in this neighborhood. High-end cars getting snatched by people coming up from the city. You don't look like you belong in this zip code. And you sure as hell don't look like you own a $100,000 car. So you're going to shut your mouth and do exactly what I tell you." There it was, the quiet part spoken out loud. "You don't look like you belong in this zip code." Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Elliot saw curtains part in the large bay window of the Langford residence. Mrs. Patricia Langford, a retired school teacher who sometimes brought over fresh cookies during the holidays, stood in her robe, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The public spectacle was agonizing. The flashing lights painted a narrative for anyone watching. Elliot was a threat, a suspect, a criminal. Greer began to pat him down, hands running aggressively down the sides of his suit jacket. It was meant to be a search for weapons, but the roughness was designed purely to establish dominance, to humiliate. "I am advising you," Elliot said, his voice eerily calm as he stared at his reflection in the Audi's tinted window, "that you are making a career-ending mistake." Greer chuckled darkly. "Yeah, I've heard that one before." He reached to his belt and unclipped his handcuffs. The metallic snick of the cuffs tightening around Elliot's wrists felt surreal. The steel was cold against his skin. He had spent years reading police reports, reviewing body cam footage of excessive force, and drafting federal consent decrees to reform broken police departments. He understood the mechanics of an arrest intimately. But feeling his arms pulled behind his back, shoulders straining awkwardly, was a stark, visceral reminder of the absolute vulnerability of being on the other side of the badge. "Walk!" Greer commanded, grabbing him by the elbow and marching him out of the garage, down the driveway, and toward the street. "You're making a mistake, Stan," Officer Ward muttered, finally finding a shred of his voice as he trailed behind. "He hasn't done anything aggressive. He's uncooperative, and he matches the profile of the theft ring," Greer shot back, not breaking stride. "I'm not letting him reach into a vehicle for a briefcase. Could be a weapon in there. We secure the suspect first. Figure out the details later." He guided Elliot to the curb right in front of the police cruiser's flashing headlights and pushed him down. "Sit." Elliot refused to sit on the cold, damp concrete. He locked his knees, standing tall despite the handcuffs binding his arms. "I will stand." Greer looked like he was about to physically force him to the ground, but he caught Mrs. Langford watching from across the street. He gritted his teeth. "Fine, stand. Ward, watch him. I'm running the plates." Greer turned and walked back to the driver's side of the police cruiser, leaving the younger officer standing awkwardly a few feet away from Elliot. The night air was getting colder. Elliot stood straight, chin held high, eyes locked, dead ahead. He refused to look at Ward. He refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing him upset. "Look, sir," Ward said quietly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "If you just give us a straight answer. Whose house is this?" Elliot slowly turned his head to look at him. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of fear. "I've told you, it is my house. That is my car. You have illegally detained me, and you have assaulted me. What is your badge number, Officer Ward?" Ward swallowed hard. "Badge 4892, and my partner's is 21104. Elliot nodded once. "And your definition of doing your job is profiling a black man pulling into his own garage, ignoring his explanations, and placing him in handcuffs without reasonable suspicion. You are complicit, Officer Ward. Standing there in silence while your partner violates my civil rights does not shield you from liability. It includes you in it." Inside the cruiser, the radio crackled to life. Greer had the window rolled down, and the dispatcher's voice echoed loudly into the quiet street. "Unit 4 Bravo, dispatch. Be advised, returning information on Virginia plate Alpha Tango Niner 70. Greer leaned forward, grabbing the radio mic. "Go ahead, dispatch. Vehicle is a 2024 Audi A8. Registered owner is Elliot Vance. No wants, no warrants. Registration is current." There was a pause. Ward looked at Elliot, his eyes widening slightly. Greer keyed the mic again. "Dispatch, what's the registered address on that vehicle?" "Registered address is 1247 Willow Creek Lane, McLean, Virginia." Ward looked at the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The brass numbers gleamed in the flashing lights. 1247. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the front yard. The only sound was the low rumble of the police cruiser's engine. Ward looked at Elliot, all the color draining from his face. He finally realized that the man standing before him in the tailored suit wasn't a liar, wasn't a thief, and wasn't afraid of them. He was exactly who he said he was. "Greer!" Ward called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Hey, Greer, you hear that? It's his car. It's his house." Greer stepped out of the cruiser. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed. The ego of a man accustomed to absolute authority does not shatter easily. It simply looks for a new angle of attack. "Doesn't prove anything," Greer muttered, marching back over to them. "Could be a stolen car, and he hasn't reported it yet. Or maybe he stole the identity of the homeowner." Even Ward looked shocked at the absurdity of the claim. "Stan, come on, man. It matches. Just take the cuffs off." "I am not taking the cuffs off until I see a physical ID that matches his face," Greer snapped, walking past Elliot and heading straight for the Audi parked in the garage. "Do not enter my vehicle," Elliot said, his voice ringing out sharply into the night. Greer ignored him. He walked into the garage, opened the passenger door of the Audi, and began rifling through Elliot's expensive leather briefcase. Elliot watched him violate his property, the anger inside calcifying into a cold, hard determination. They had crossed every line. They had ignored protocol, law, and basic human decency. Greer emerged from the garage a moment later, holding a small leather wallet. He flipped it open and pulled out a driver's license. He held it up to his flashlight, squinting at the small text. He looked at the photo. He looked at Elliot. He looked back at the photo. "Elliot Vance," Greer read aloud, his voice losing a fraction of its bravado. "Now look at the other card in that wallet, Officer Greer," Elliot commanded softly. "The one right behind the driver's license." Greer frowned, his thumb sliding behind the plastic ID to reveal a solid silver badge and a heavy laminated federal credential card. The flashlight beam hit the seal of the Department of Justice. The bold letters across the top read, "Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Civil Rights Division." Greer stopped breathing. For 3 full seconds, the universe seemed to stand completely still. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died down. The only thing moving was the red and blue lights washing over Greer's suddenly pale face. He stared at the federal badge, the heavy realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. He hadn't just detained an innocent homeowner. He had handcuffed a federal prosecutor. Not just any prosecutor. A high-ranking official whose exact job description involved investigating and prosecuting police departments for civil rights abuses. "Officer Ward," Elliot said, not breaking eye contact with Greer. "I suggest you radio your watch commander immediately. Ask for Captain Raymond Pierce. Tell him he needs to get down to 1247 Willow Creek Lane right now. And tell him to bring his checkbook, because the lawsuit I am going to drop on this precinct tomorrow morning will bankrupt this city." The silence that followed Elliot's demand was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath out of the 2 patrolmen. Officer Stanley Greer stood frozen by the passenger door of the Audi, the leather wallet trembling ever so slightly in his thick hand. The flashing red and blue strobes of the cruiser reflected off the silver Department of Justice badge, transforming the emblem of federal authority into a blinding beacon of his catastrophic failure. Greer's mind scrambled for a lifeline, a loophole, an excuse. He was a 15-year veteran of the force. He was used to the streets bending to his will. He was used to civilians cowering, apologizing, deferring. He was not used to a man in handcuffs calmly dictating the terms of his professional demise. "Ward," Greer croaked, his voice stripped of all its previous bass and bravado. "Ward, get on the radio." Officer Ethan Ward didn't need to be told twice. He was already backing away from Elliot as if he were made of radioactive material. He unclipped his shoulder mic his fingers fumbling with the button. "Dispatch, this is 4 Bravo. We need the watch commander at this location. Code 3 for Bravo." "Dispatch, copy. What is the nature of the emergency?" Ward looked at Elliot, then at Greer. "Just tell Captain Pierce to get down here immediately. Priority 1. Elliot remained standing by the curb, the cold autumn wind biting through his white shirt. The steel handcuffs bit into his wrists, a sharp, constant reminder of the indignity he was enduring. But his posture never broke. He stood straight, shoulders pulled back, eyes fixed coldly on Greer, who was now slowly walking back toward him, looking like a man marching to the gallows. "Sir, Mr. Vance," Greer stammered, the authoritative bark replaced by a sickeningly sweet, placating tone that made Elliot's stomach turn. "Listen, there's been a massive misunderstanding here, a colossal mix-up. It's dark, you know. The tint on your windows is heavy." He reached out, his hand hovering near Elliot's bound wrists. "Let's just get these off you, okay? No harm, no foul. We can laugh about this." "Do not touch me," Elliot said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal, icy edge that stopped Greer dead in his tracks. "Sir, I'm just trying to take the cuffs off," Greer pleaded, his eyes darting nervously toward the Langford house, where the porch light still illuminated Mrs. Langford in her window, a silent witness to the entire ordeal. "You put them on without reasonable, articulable suspicion," Elliot replied, his gaze boring into Greer's skull. "You placed your hands on me without provocation. You trespassed on my property, illegally searched my vehicle, and detained a federal officer. You don't get to quietly undo those actions because you suddenly realized you picked the wrong target. Your watch commander will remove these handcuffs, not you." "Are you crazy?" Greer whispered harshly, the panic finally breaking through his polite facade. "You're going to stand out here in cuffs? You want the whole neighborhood to see this?" "I want the record to be absolutely clear," Elliot countered seamlessly. "I want your superior officer to witness exactly how you conduct yourself in the field. I want him to see the liability you represent." For 10 agonizing minutes, nobody moved. The only sounds were the low rumble of the cruiser's engine, the crackle of the police radio, and Greer's ragged, anxious breathing. He paced a tight circle on the driveway, rubbing his hand over his mouth, trying to mentally assemble a narrative that could save him. Ward simply stood by the cruiser, staring at his boots, realizing his career might be over before he even made detective. Then the wail of a siren pierced the quiet suburban air. A heavy black Ford Explorer SUV turned onto Willow Creek Lane, its lights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle came to an aggressive halt directly behind Greer's cruiser, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. The driver's side door slammed open, and Captain Raymond Pierce stepped out. Pierce was a man in his late 50s, a pragmatic, hardened precinct commander who had spent 30 years navigating the political minefields of local law enforcement. He was 6 months away from a very comfortable pension, and receiving a frantic Code 3 call to one of the wealthiest streets in his jurisdiction at midnight was exactly the kind of headache he despised. Pierce marched up the driveway, his hand resting on his duty belt, his eyes scanning the scene. He saw his 2 officers looking panicked. He saw the expensive Audi in the garage. And then he saw the black man in the tailored suit standing in handcuffs under the harsh glare of the spotlights. "What the hell is going on here?" Pierce barked, his voice thick with authority and annoyance. "Greer, Ward, report." Greer hurried over to the captain, speaking in a low, rapid hush. "Cap, we got a situation. We were tracking a suspected stolen vehicle. Matched the profile of the theft ring. Suspect was uncooperative. We detained him for officer safety, but—" Greer swallowed hard, looking back at Elliot. "But it's his house, Cap, and he's DOJ." Pierce stopped walking. He looked at Greer, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "He's what?" "Department of Justice," Greer whispered. "Civil Rights Division." Pierce's eyes widened, the blood draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the disaster crystallized in his mind. He didn't just have a racial profiling complaint on his hands. He had detained an official from the very federal agency that possessed the power to place his entire police department under a federal consent decree. Without another word to Greer, Pierce bypassed his officers and walked straight toward Elliot. "Sir," Pierce said, his tone instantly shifting to one of deep, respectful caution. "I am Captain Raymond Pierce. I am the watch commander for this district. I am incredibly sorry for this situation." He reached out gently. "Please allow me to remove those restraints." Elliot turned his back slightly, presenting his bound wrists. "Proceed, Captain." The metal clicked and the cuffs fell away. Elliot slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing the raw red indentations on his wrists. He didn't rub them furiously. He traced the marks methodically, ensuring Pierce saw exactly what his men had done to his skin. "Captain Pierce," Elliot said, his voice steady and echoing in the quiet street. "Are you familiar with Title 18, United States Code, Section 242? Pierce winced. He knew it well. "Deprivation of rights under color of law." "Yes." "Excellent. Then you understand the gravity of what has transpired here tonight," Elliot said, turning to face him. "Because your officers did not just make a mistake. They executed a textbook violation of my Fourth Amendment rights, heavily motivated by racial profiling, and compounded it with physical battery." "Mr. Vance," Pierce started, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I understand you are upset, and you have every right to be. This was a colossal error in judgment on the part of my officers. But let's step inside, out of the cold. Let's talk about this off the street. We can handle this internally. I assure you, Officer Greer will face severe disciplinary action." "We will not step inside," Elliot replied, anchoring his feet to the driveway. "And you will not handle this internally. The era of internal police investigations covering up blatant civil rights violations is precisely what my division was built to dismantle." He gestured toward Greer, who was lingering nervously by the cruiser. "Officer Greer informed me that I didn't look like I belonged in this zip code. He demanded I step out of my vehicle while parked inside my private garage without establishing probable cause. When I calmly informed him of my rights, he physically assaulted me, spun me against my vehicle, and placed me in restraints." Pierce turned a furious glare toward Greer. "Is that true, Greer?" Greer stepped forward, his survival instincts kicking in. The polite, apologetic demeanor vanished, replaced by the defensive posture of a cornered animal. He knew his career was on the line, and his only hope was to mudsling. "Captain, that is not entirely accurate," Greer lied smoothly, his chest puffing out slightly. "The suspect, the homeowner, was highly agitated. He was combative from the moment I approached the window. When I asked for his identification, he refused to comply and made a sudden aggressive reach toward the passenger seat of the vehicle. In the dark, fearing he was reaching for a weapon, I detained him for officer safety. It was a chaotic scene, Captain. I followed protocol to secure the area." Elliot actually smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a razor-thin, predatory curvature of his lips that made Pierce's stomach drop. "A sudden aggressive reach," Elliot repeated, tasting the lie. "Combative. Officer safety. You have clearly memorized the union-approved buzzwords to justify excessive force." "Officer Greer, it's the truth," Greer insisted, looking to Ward for support. Ward looked away, refusing to corroborate the lie, but too terrified to speak the truth. "Let's check the tape then," Elliot said simply. "Captain Pierce, as per departmental policy, both of these officers should be wearing Axon body cameras. I suggest we pull Officer Greer's footage right now to verify his claim that I lunged for a weapon. Greer's face twitched. He reached up and tapped the small black square mounted on the center of his chest. Cap, in the rush to respond to the suspicious vehicle, I failed to initialize the recording. The camera was off. But my partner was here. He saw him resisting. Pierce closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. An unrecorded interaction, a use of force, a minority suspect, a high-ranking DOJ official, and a conveniently dead body camera. It was the absolute worst-case scenario. It was the kind of incident that made national news and ended careers from the patrol level all the way up to the chief of police. "You turned your camera off," Pierce growled, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "It was an accident, Cap. The battery might have died," Greer pleaded. "But he was aggressive. I had to lock him down." "Are you absolutely certain about that narrative, Officer Greer?" Elliot asked. He took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The man in the suit was now entirely in command of the armed men in uniform. "Are you absolutely certain you want to make an official verbal statement to your commanding officer that I reached for a weapon and resisted arrest?" "I know what happened." Greer spat, doubling down. "You can throw your federal weight around all you want, but it's my word against yours, and I am a sworn officer of the law. Nobody is going to believe you were just sitting there like an angel." "Your word against mine," Elliot echoed softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, the blue light illuminating his sharp features. "Officer Greer, because of the nature of my work prosecuting white supremacist organizations, corrupt law enforcement agencies, and domestic terrorists, my personal security is managed by the United States Marshals Service," Elliot explained, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying clarity. He turned the screen of his phone toward Captain Pierce. "As a condition of my residency, the Marshals mandated the installation of a hardwired, tamper-proof, military-grade, audio-visual surveillance network on this property. There are 3 hidden 4K cameras inside that garage. There is one mounted beneath the eaves above the driveway. There is another concealed in the landscaping. They do not run on batteries. They cannot be turned off. And they record high-fidelity audio." Greer's jaw went slack. The blood that had rushed to his face in his defensive anger instantly vanished, leaving him looking like a ghost. Elliot tapped a button on his phone. The tiny, perfectly clear audio of Officer Greer's voice played from the phone speaker. "Oh, you're a lawyer now. Listen to me very carefully. You don't look like you belong in this zip code, and you sure as hell don't look like you own a $100,000 car." The recording played the sound of Greer slapping the roof of the car. It played the sound of Elliot calmly explaining his rights. It played the unmistakable scuffle of Greer grabbing him, shoving him against the car, and ignoring his compliance. Captain Pierce stared at the phone in horror. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and damning. Every second of your illegal stop, your racial profiling, your physical assault, and your subsequent attempt to lie to your commanding officer has been recorded in 4K resolution, Elliot said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Furthermore, the footage is not stored locally. It is live uploaded to a secure federal server at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Even if you tried to confiscate my phone, the evidence is already out of your reach. He looked at Pierce, his eyes burning with righteous, unstoppable fury. "Captain Pierce, by 6:52 a.m. tomorrow, this footage will be on the desk of the Attorney General of the United States. By 8:07 a.m., my personal attorneys will file a civil rights lawsuit against Officer Greer, Officer Ward, you as their commanding officer, and the entire city. And by 1:45 p.m., I will personally ensure that the DOJ Civil Rights Division opens a sweeping systemic investigation into the patterns and practices of this police department. Pierce looked like he was going to be sick. Mr. Vance, please. Is there any way we can rectify this? We will terminate him immediately. He will never wear a badge again. Elliot looked at Greer, who was now trembling visibly, his career, his pension, and his freedom evaporating before his very eyes. You don't get it, Captain, Elliot said softly. This isn't about him anymore. It's about the system that made him think he could get away with it. You wanted to know if I belonged in this zip code, Officer Greer. I do, and I'm going to own a very large piece of your police department by the time I'm finished with it. The first pale light of dawn had just begun to paint the sky above the Potomac when Elliot Vance walked through the heavy, ornate bronze doors of the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building. He hadn't slept a single minute. The adrenaline from the night before had long since metabolized into a cold, hyper-focused fury. Beneath the crisp cuffs of his fresh, stark white shirt, his wrists were encircled by dark purple mottled bruises, a physical testament to the indignity he had endured. But as he strode down the cavernous marble-lined hallways of the DOJ, his mind operated with the terrifying mechanical precision of a predator that had finally caught the scent of blood. By 6:52 a.m., the high-definition footage from his garage's secure audio-visual surveillance network had been successfully downloaded, decrypted, and securely transmitted to 3 separate highly classified offices within the building. At 8:07 a.m., Elliot was seated at the head of a massive polished mahogany conference table on the 5th floor inside a soundproofed SCIF. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee. Across from him sat Deputy Attorney General Leonard Shaw. Shaw was a seasoned legal veteran whose typically unflappable demeanor had weathered decades of Washington scandals and high-profile terrorism trials. Right now, however, his stoic composure was completely fractured by sheer, unadulterated outrage as he watched the garage footage play out on the massive 80-inch monitor mounted to the wall. Beside him sat Special Agent in Charge Gregory Holt of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Holt was a stoic, analytical man who viewed the world entirely through the lens of data and criminal leverage. He leaned forward, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his eyes unblinking as the digital recording played. The tiny, perfectly clear audio of Officer Stanley Greer echoing in the secure room felt almost surreal. You don't look like you belong in this zip code, and you sure as hell don't look like you own a $100,000 car. They watched in silence as Greer forcibly spun Elliot against the Audi. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists made Shaw wince visibly. As the video finally concluded with Elliot's chilling, legally precise promise to Captain Pierce out on the street, the monitor faded to black. The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the low hum of the building's HVAC system. Shaw slowly took off his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, ragged breath. I've seen a lot of racial profiling cases in my 30 years at this department, Elliot. I've read the transcripts. I've seen the dash cams. But the sheer, unbridled, comfortable arrogance of this, doing it inside your own home under the guise of an investigation, it's absolutely indefensible. It's far more than indefensible, Leonard, Elliot said. His voice was calm, but it held a lethal edge. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder across the mahogany table. It's not an isolated incident of implicit bias. It is heavily protected systemic rot. I spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing Officer Stanley Greer's arrest records and internal affairs files for the past 5 years. Shaw opened the folder, his eyes scanning the dense spreadsheets Elliot had compiled. He has 42 separate complaints against him for excessive force, unlawful detention, and verbal abuse, Elliot continued, his tone clinical and damning. 9 of those 42 complaints were filed by Black and Hispanic motorists. And here is the kicker. The Alexandria Precinct's Internal Affairs Division cleared him every single time. They cited lack of corroborating evidence or justified officer safety. The precinct didn't just fail to supervise him, they actively insulated him. Captain Pierce has been running a protection racket for badges. Agent Holt finally moved, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked at the printouts, but his mind seemed to be working on a completely different puzzle. You're right about the systemic failure, Elliot. Your division could easily crush them on the civil rights violations alone. But you missed something in your midnight research. Something that turns this from a localized racist civil rights violation into a massive multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy. Elliot raised an eyebrow, his prosecutorial instincts instantly flaring. Show me, Gregory, what am I missing? Holt pulled out a digital tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and projected a highly detailed topographical map of the McLean, Arlington, and Fairfax suburbs onto the large monitor. The map was clustered with dozens of digital pins, some red, some blue. When you mentioned Greer's initial excuse in the garage, that he was looking for a high-end car theft ring, it rang a massive bell, Holt explained, standing up and pointing a laser pointer at the screen. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force has been quietly tracking a highly sophisticated auto theft syndicate operating in Northern Virginia for the last 8 months. They exclusively target luxury vehicles: Audi, Mercedes, Porsche, high-end Range Rovers. The cars vanish in the middle of the night and are usually stripped or shipped out of the port of Baltimore in shipping containers within 48 hours. Holt dragged the map, zooming in on the wealthy suburban grids. We've been completely baffled by how clean their escapes are. They always seem to know exactly where the local police patrols are. They never hit a roadblock. They never get caught on dash cams fleeing the scene. It's like they have a radar for law enforcement blind spots. Holt tapped the tablet again, isolating just the blue pins. We subpoenaed the GPS transponder logs for every patrol cruiser in that district this morning. These blue pins represent the exact patrol locations of Officer Greer and Officer Ward's cruiser over the last 6 months during the midnight shift. He tapped the screen one final time, bringing up the red pins, which represented the exact addresses and estimated times of the luxury vehicle thefts. Elliot's eyes widened as he stared at the sprawling digital web. It was a perfect, undeniably calculated negative correlation. Wherever Greer and Ward's cruiser was aggressively patrolling, flashing its lights and running plates, the actual thefts were happening exactly 2 to 3 miles away in the opposite direction. They weren't hunting the theft ring, Elliot, Holt said, his voice dropping to a grim, resonant timbre. They were on the payroll. The twist hit Elliot like a physical blow, instantly recontextualizing the entire terrifying nightmare in his garage. The pieces fell into place with a sickening, terrifying clarity. They provided the perimeter, Elliot deduced, his mind racing ahead of the data. Greer and Ward were acting as lookouts on the police radio. They had access to dispatch. They knew where the other units were and when they needed to look like they were proactively patrolling to keep their captain and dispatch off their backs. They pulled over minorities in wealthy neighborhoods. Shaw finished for him, the absolute disgust evident in his voice. They used textbook racial profiling as a tactical smokescreen. They knew a black man in a $100,000 Audi was the perfect easy target. Greer figured he could harass you, detain you, and run your plates for 30 to 40 minutes, artificially generating police activity, while the real thieves cleared out a driveway 3 blocks over. He used his racism to camouflage a highly lucrative criminal enterprise. Elliot looked down at the dark bruises on his wrists. The anger he felt from the night before suddenly crystallized into something much colder, much heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't just a victim of a racist cop anymore. He was the key to dismantling a corrupt syndicate. "Leonard," Elliot said, looking up at the Deputy Attorney General, his eyes burning with unyielding resolve. "I want the mandate. I want full authorization for Title 18, United States Code, Sections 241 and 242, conspiracy against rights and deprivation of rights under color of law." He paused, turning to the FBI agent. "But I also want the RICO predicates for the auto theft ring: wire fraud, grand larceny, aiding and abetting. We tie the civil rights violations directly to the racketeering enterprise." Shaw stared at him for a long moment, seeing the absolute iron in his posture. He nodded slowly, firmly. "You have it. The Civil Rights Division and the FBI will run this as a joint federal task force. Agent Holt, assemble your tactical teams. I want warrants drafted by noon." Shaw looked back at the frozen frame of Greer on the monitor, then to Elliot. "Elliot, I want this precinct taken apart brick by brick." At 1:45 p.m. that same day, the McLean Police Department's 4th Precinct was operating exactly as it always did. Officers were chatting by the coffee machine, dispatchers were fielding routine calls, and Captain Raymond Pierce was sitting in his office, frantically trying to draft an incident report that might somehow save his pension. He had suspended Greer and Ward pending an investigation, hoping a swift administrative action might appease the federal prosecutor they had inexplicably detained. He had no idea that a hurricane was already at his door. The heavy glass doors of the precinct swung open in unison. But it wasn't the public walking in, and it wasn't a SWAT team kicking down the doors. It was worse. 24 federal agents in immaculate dark suits, wearing FBI raid jackets and carrying hard plastic evidence bins, flooded into the lobby. They moved with terrifying silent efficiency. Behind them walked Gregory Holt, and beside him, wearing a sharp navy blue trench coat that concealed the bruises on his wrists, was Elliot Vance. The chatter in the precinct died instantly. The desk sergeant stood up, his hand hovering near his radio. "Can I help you, Special Agent Holt?" "FBI," Holt announced, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. "This precinct is currently executing a federal search warrant. All personnel are ordered to step away from their computers. Leave your cell phones on your desks and assemble in the briefing room. Anyone who touches a keyboard will be arrested for obstruction of justice." Captain Pierce burst out of his office at the commotion. When he saw Elliot standing in the center of his precinct, flanked by federal agents, the remaining color drained from his face. "Mr. Vance," Pierce stammered, "I told you we are handling Officer Greer internally. He's been suspended." "Captain Pierce, your Internal Affairs Division is being seized as we speak," Elliot interrupted, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Agent Holt is taking possession of your dispatch logs, your GPS patrol data, and every internal affairs complaint filed in the last decade. Furthermore, you are hereby relieved of your command pending a federal investigation into systemic corruption and civil rights abuses." Before Pierce could even process the words, the back doors of the precinct opened. 2 FBI agents walked in, escorting a man in handcuffs. It was Officer Stanley Greer. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was in sweatpants and a t-shirt, having been pulled out of his house an hour prior. He looked disheveled, terrified, and utterly defeated. As the agents walked him through the bullpen of his own precinct, his fellow officers stared in shock. Greer's eyes met Elliot's. The arrogant sneer from the night before was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized he had flown too close to the sun and had his wings completely incinerated. Elliot walked slowly toward him. The precinct was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Officer Greer," Elliot said, stopping 2 feet away from him. Greer swallowed hard, unable to look him in the eye. "I didn't know," he whispered pathetically. "I didn't know who you were." "That is exactly the point," Elliot replied coldly. "You didn't know I was a federal prosecutor. You thought I was just a civilian. You thought I was someone without a voice, someone without the power to fight back against your badge. You thought you could brutalize me in the dark and cover it up with a lie." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping so only Greer could hear the final nail in his coffin. "We found the bank accounts, Stanley. We know about the kickbacks from the chop shops in Baltimore. You used the badge to prey on minorities to cover up your own felonies. You are not just going to lose your job. You are going to federal prison for a very, very long time. And when you get there, you'll be just another inmate who used to be a cop." Greer's knees buckled slightly, but the FBI agents held him up by his arms, marching him straight toward the holding cells, the very same cells where he had locked up countless innocent people over his career. Officer Ethan Ward, who had been brought in separately, was currently sitting in an interrogation room, singing like a canary in exchange for immunity, detailing exactly how the theft ring operated and how Greer had coerced him into participating. Over the next 6 months, the fallout was catastrophic for the corrupt elements of the department. Chief of Police Thomas Albright was forced into an early, disgraced retirement. Captain Raymond Pierce was fired for extreme negligence. Stanley Greer pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy and civil rights charges, receiving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Most importantly, the McLean Police Department was placed under a sweeping federal consent decree. Elliot personally oversaw the drafting of the document. It mandated sweeping overhauls, mandatory unalterable body camera protocols, an independent civilian review board with subpoena power, and a complete restructuring of their traffic stop policies. Nearly a year after the incident, Elliot Vance drove his midnight blue Audi A8 down Willow Creek Lane. It was late, just past 11:15 p.m. The autumn air was crisp, and the neighborhood was silent. He pressed the button on his visor. The heavy wooden garage door ascended. He pulled inside, the familiar smell of motor oil and cedar greeting him. He shifted the car into park and turned off the ignition. He sat there in the silence for a moment. No flashing red and blue lights, no booming voices on a PA system, just the quiet sanctuary of the home he had earned. Elliot stepped out of the car, his shoes clicking softly against the concrete. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't feel the paralyzing fear that Greer had tried to instill in him. He had taken the worst they had to throw at him, and he had used it to forge a weapon that protected not just himself, but thousands of people who would never even know his name. He picked up his briefcase, walked into his house, and locked the door behind him. Justice wasn't just a concept he argued in a courtroom anymore. It was the peace he felt in his own home. Elliot Vance's story is a chilling reminder of the abuse of power that can hide behind a badge. But more importantly, it's a testament to the unstoppable force of justice when the corrupt pick the wrong target. True power isn't about intimidating the vulnerable in the dark. It's about dragging the truth into the light and forcing the system to change. If this story made your blood boil and your heart cheer for absolute justice, hit that like button. Share this to remind everyone that nobody is above the law. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more incredible, jaw-dropping true-life dramas. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Elliot's shoes? Let's get the discussion started.